The hallways of Northwood High had a certain sound to them, a kind of low-level hum of expectation. It was in the way the lockers clicked shut, with a satisfying finality. In the echo of confident laughter bouncing off the polished floors, in the determined footsteps of students who seemed to know exactly which path they were on. For the most part, these were the sounds of a world that felt familiar to its inhabitants, a world of advanced placement classes, college applications, and weekend parties. For one quiet 17-year-old, however, it was the soundtrack to a movie he was only watching, not starring in. He had learned the art of being invisible early on. It wasn't a conscious decision like choosing a major or a sports team, but more of a necessary skill, like learning to swim or ride a bike. You either figured out how to navigate the currents without making waves, or you risked being pulled under. At Northwood, being one of the few faces in the sea of students that didn't match the majority was its own kind of education. It taught you to be observant, to notice the subtle shifts in mood, to understand the unspoken rules that governed everything from who sat with whom at lunch to who got picked for a group project. His invisibility was a shield. It was a cloak he pulled tightly around himself every morning as he walked through the front doors. His real world, the one where he wasn't a silent observer, existed in two places. The first was behind a drum set. There was nothing invisible about playing the drums. It was a physical, visceral act. It was about letting loose a controlled chaos, about being the heartbeat of a song. When he was drumming, his hands usually tucked into his pockets or clasped calmly on a desk, were in constant motion. They were a blur of motion, striking skins and cymbals, creating a rhythm that was powerful and undeniable. In those moments, he wasn't just the quiet kid from the hallway. He was the engine, the pulse, the force that made everyone tap their feet and nod their heads. It was a language he spoke fluently, language of syncopation and soul that needed no translation. The second place his world felt real was the music room. But even there, he was a man of two worlds. The music room was a large, sunlit space filled with instruments of all kinds. There were guitars in the corner, a brass section tucked away in their cases. And center stage, bathed in the soft light from a large window, was the piano. It wasn't just any piano. It was a grand piano. It's a gleaming black Steinway that looked less like an instrument and more like a piece of furniture from a palace. Its lid was propped open, revealing the hammers and strings that were its heart, and its black and white keys seemed to gleam with a kind of silent authority. This piano was the unofficial throne of the music room. It was reserved for the school's prodigies, the students who had been playing since they could walk, who could flawlessly execute pieces by composers with long, complicated names. These were the students who wore their talent like a comfortable coat. They would sit at the Steinway, their backs straight, their fingers dancing across the ivories with an ease that was both beautiful and intimidating. They would play Chopin, Bach, Mozart, and the room would fill with a kind of elegant, structured beauty that felt very important and very far away from him. He loved to listen to them play. He would often find himself in the music room during his free period, not to practice his own instrument, but just to be in the presence of that sound. He would find a spot in the back, maybe sitting on the floor behind a stack of amplifiers, and just listen. He would watch the hands of the pianists, the way they moved with such precision and grace. He would close his eyes and let the notes wash over him, trying to understand the stories they were telling. He could appreciate the skill, the discipline, the sheer artistry of it. But he never touched the piano. To him, it felt like a museum piece, something to be admired from a distance. It was a symbol of a world of classical music that was as foreign to him as another country. It was a world of formal concerts and stiff collars, a world that seemed to have its own set of rules. And he was quite sure he didn't know any of them, so he would sit in his hiding spot. And as the classical melodies filled the room, his own fingers would be busy. He would tap out rhythms on his knees, on the floor, on the cool metal of the amplifier beside him. He wasn't trying to copy the piano music. He was translating it. He would find the underlying beat, the pulse hidden within the complex melody. No. And he would accent it with his own percussive language. He would add a syncopated bass line here, a sizzling hi-hat rhythm there. He was deconstructing the music and rebuilding it in his own image, turning the elegant waltz into a slow, soulful groove, or the frantic fugue into a complex polyrhythmic puzzle. It was his secret conversation with the music, a dialogue that no one else in the room knew was happening. The piano was the sun, and the other musicians, including him on his drums, were planets in its orbit. It was the main event. His drumming was the foundation, the rhythm section, the support system for the real stars. And he was okay with that. He found his own power in that role. But the piano itself remained a mystery, a beautiful, intimidating monument to a tradition he had never been invited to join. It was a symbol of everything at Northwood. It felt just out of reach. This feeling of being on the outside wasn't limited to the music room. It was a constant undercurrent in his daily life. In his history class, when they talked about the civil rights movement, he could feel every eye in the room flicker towards him for a split second. A silent, awkward gesture that made him want to shrink into his chair. In English class, when they read a book by a black author, the teacher would sometimes look at him, as if expecting him to provide some special insider commentary. He never knew what to say. He was just a kid who had read the same book as everyone else. He didn't have a secret decoder ring. He had friends, of course. A small group of guys he'd known since middle school. Other kids who understood the feeling of navigating a space that wasn't quite built for them. They would hang out together, eat lunch together, crack jokes that only they understood. They were his anchors, the people who made him feel seen. But even with them, there was a shared understanding that you had to be careful. You couldn't be too loud, too opinionated, too... You had to stay within the lines, so he kept his world small and manageable. He went to his classes, did his work, kept his head down. He excelled in his own quiet way, getting good grades without ever raising his hand too often. He went to the band room after school and lost himself in the rhythm of the drums. He listened to the piano players from his hiding spot, his fingers tapping out his own secret beats. It was a good life, a safe life. It was a life built on a carefully maintained equilibrium. He was a master of his small, invisible kingdom. And he had no desire to be a prince in anyone else's. He never looked at the Steinway and thought, I wish I could play that. It was like looking at the moon and wishing you could live there. It was a nice thought, but it was impossible, a fantasy. The keys were for other people, for people with different hands, different backgrounds, different lives. His hands were for drumsticks, for creating a different kind of music, a different kind of energy. He was content in his corner of the world, a quiet observer with a rhythm in his soul that was all his own. He had no idea that his carefully constructed world was about to be shattered, and that the very instrument he saw, a distant monument, was about to become the stage for the most impossible challenge of his life. The announcement came during the final school-wide assembly of the week, a gathering that always felt more like a pep rally for a school that didn't need any more pep. The air in the auditorium was thick with the low murmur of 1,000 conversations, the rustle of Letterman jackets, and the faint, sweet smell of candy being passed in secret rows. The principal, a man whose face seemed to be permanently set in a stern, unimpressed line, stood at the podium on the stage. His name was a weight in the room, a presence that demanded silence even before he spoke. He was the kind of man who wore a suit even on casual Fridays, whose shoes were always shined to a mirror gleam, and whose voice carried a note of absolute, unshakable authority. He ran Northwood High not like a school, but like a well-oiled, very expensive machine, and he did not tolerate any parts that didn't work exactly as they were supposed to. The principal cleared his throat, and the auditorium fell quiet. It wasn't an instant silence, but a gradual one. A wave of hushing that rolled from the front rows to the back. He began his usual announcements, a rundown of upcoming deadlines, reminder about dress code violations, a warning about the consequences of tardiness. It was the same script he read every week. And most of the students were only half listening, their minds already on the weekend. The quiet teenager, sitting near the middle of the sea of faces, was no different. He was tracing the pattern of the cracks in the plastic seat in front of him, his mind already drifting towards the band room and the comforting feel of drumsticks in his hands. Then, the principal's tone changed. It became sharper, more urgent. He was talking about the annual Winter Showcase, the school's biggest event of the year. It was a night of performances and presentations designed to showcase the best and brightest of Northwood. Spectacle for parents, alumni, and important community members. It was the principal's pride and joy, his personal exhibition of the school's excellence. As you know, the principal boomed, his voice bouncing off the walls. The Winter Showcase is just 1 week away. It is a night that reflects the very soul of this institution. It is a night for excellence. He paused for dramatic effect, letting the word hang in the air. And I have just been informed that there has been a change in the program. A murmur went through the crowd. A change in the program this late was unheard of. It was like changing the recipe for a cake after it was already in the oven. The student who was scheduled to perform the piano solo, a very challenging piece by the composer list, has unfortunately taken ill and will not be able to perform. He let the news sink in. The piano solo was a centerpiece of the showcase, a moment for the school's top music student to shine. The principal looked out over the faces, his eyes scanning the crowd like a searchlight. The quiet boy felt a prickle of unease. He didn't know why, but a sense of dread began to creep up his spine. He had a bad feeling, a gut instinct that something was about to happen. He slumped down in his seat, trying to make himself smaller, praying that the principal's searchlight would pass right over him. "This leaves a significant hole in our program," the principal continued, his voice hardening. "A hole that cannot be left empty. The show must go on, and it must go on with the same level of excellence that this school is known for. We need a replacement. We need a pianist." He paused again, and the silence in the auditorium was now heavy with tension. No one moved. No one spoke. The other skilled musicians in the school were already in the program, but they knew they weren't ready for something so difficult. The piece was famous for being a monster. A whirlwind of notes that required years of dedicated practice. Then, the principal's eyes stopped scanning. They had found their target. "You there?" he said, his voice suddenly loud and direct, cutting through the silence like a knife. The young man in the gray sweater, "Stand up." For a second, the boy didn't realize he was the one being spoken to. He looked around, but everyone was looking at him. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on his back, on his neck, on his face. His heart started to pound, a frantic, chaotic rhythm against his ribs. Slowly, mechanically, he pushed himself to his feet. His legs felt weak, like they might give out from under him. The auditorium lights seemed to be brighter, hotter than before. The principal said, a flicker of something like satisfaction in his eyes. "You're a musician, aren't you? I've seen you in the band room." The boy's mouth was dry. He could barely get the words out. "Yes, sir," he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. "Good. Then you will fill the slot. You will play the Liszt piece." A wave of shock washed over him, followed by a cold rush of panic. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a mistake. "Sir," he said, his voice a little louder now, laced with desperation. I can't. I don't play piano. I'm a drummer." The principal let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a dismissive, mocking sound. "Nonsense," he said, waving a hand in the air as if swatting away a fly. "It's all just music, isn't it? It's all just hitting the right keys at the right time. You're a musician. This is a musical task. It's simple logic." "But sir," the boy pleaded, his voice trembling now, "it's not simple. That piece is. It's really hard. I've never even tried to play piano. I wouldn't even know where to start." The principal's face hardened. The mask of the charming school administrator was gone, replaced by the cold, unyielding face of the authority figure. He was not asking. He was commanding. "Are you arguing with me?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. The boy shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "No, sir. I'm trying to explain." "Then let me explain something to you," the principal said, leaning forward over the podium. His voice was now a cold, hard steel. "This school has a reputation to uphold. We have a show to put on. I have made a decision, and you will not question it. You are a student at this school, and you will do your part. The sheet music is on the piano in the music room. You have a week. I suggest you use it wisely, and you will not embarrass this school. Do you understand me? The words hit him like physical blows. You will not embarrass this school. It wasn't about the music. It wasn't about the showcase. It was about him. It was about putting him in his place. This was a public spectacle, a power play designed to humiliate him. The principal was using him as an example, a way to show everyone what happened when you were part of the system but didn't quite fit the mold. He was being forced onto a stage he'd never asked for, to play an instrument he didn't know, a piece of music that was far beyond his reach. All so the principal could prove a point. He looked out at the sea of faces. He saw the shock, the pity, the morbid curiosity in their eyes. He saw his friends in the distance, their faces pale with concern. He felt completely and utterly alone, exposed and vulnerable on that hard plastic seat. There was no escape. To say no again would be to defy the principal in front of the entire school, an act of rebellion that would surely have severe consequences. To say yes was to accept an impossible task, a guaranteed public failure. He took a deep, shaky breath. The world seemed to slow down, the sounds of the auditorium fading into a dull roar in his ears. He was trapped. There was no way out. He looked back at the principal, at the cold, unfeeling eyes that were waiting for his surrender. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes, sir," he choked out. "I understand." "Good," the principal said, his expression softening slightly, the look of a man who had won his victory. "You may be seated." The boy sank back into his seat, his body feeling heavy and numb. The principal moved on to his next announcement as if nothing had happened, but the boy heard nothing else. His mind was racing, a whirlwind of fear, anger, and a deep aching sense of injustice. He could feel the eyes of the other students on him, a mixture of sympathy and silent judgment. He had been challenged, not in a fair way, but in the most cruel and public way possible. The bell rang, signaling the end of the assembly. The students began to file out of the auditorium, their whispers following him like a cloud. He didn't move. He just sat there, staring at the empty stage, the weight of the impossible task settling squarely on his shoulders. The last bell of the day felt less like a release and more like a starting gun for a race he hadn't trained for. He walked out of the auditorium in a daze, the whispers of the other students feeling like tiny needles prickling at his skin. He didn't go to his locker. He didn't stop to talk to his friends, who were looking at him with a mixture of pity and horror. He walked with a singular purpose, his feet carrying him down the now empty hallways towards the music room. It felt like he was walking to his own execution. The music room was quiet, bathed in the orange glow of the late afternoon sun streaming through the large windows. It was usually a place of comfort, a sanctuary. But today, it felt like a courtroom. And the gleaming black Steinway piano was the judge, jury, and executioner all rolled into one. He approached it slowly, his footsteps echoing in the silence. On the music stand, as the principal had said, was a thick stack of paper. The sheet music. He picked it up. It was heavier than he expected. The title at the top was in a fancy, swirling font he could barely read. Below it, the page was a dense, terrifying forest of black notes. It wasn't just music. It was a wall of sound, a complex mathematical equation that he had no hope of solving. There were so many notes packed onto the lines and in the spaces between them that they looked like a swarm of angry ants. He saw sharps and flats and strange symbols he didn't understand. He saw lines telling him to play fast, then faster, then even faster than that. This wasn't a song. It was a test of human endurance, and he was destined to fail. He sat down on the cold, hard bench. The smooth ivory keys felt alien and unforgiving under his trembling fingers. He placed his hands in the starting position as he'd seen the other pianists do, but it felt completely wrong. His hands, which were so confident and powerful when wrapped around a pair of drumsticks, felt clumsy and weak on the keyboard. He took a deep breath and tried to play the first few bars. The sound that came out was a jumbled, discordant mess. It wasn't music. It was noise. A series of wrong notes plunked out slowly and without any rhythm. It It sounded like a child had been left alone in a room with a piano and told to bang on it. He cringed, the sound echoing in the empty room, mocking him. He tried again, this time concentrating even harder, his eyes darting back and forth between the page and the keys. It was even worse. The notes were clumped together, his fingers fumbling over each other, tripping and falling. He couldn't even get through the first line without making a dozen mistakes. A hot wave of humiliation washed over him. He slammed his hands down on the keys, creating a loud, angry crash of sound that made him jump. He wasn't angry at the music. He was angry at the principal. He was angry at the situation. He was angry at himself for feeling so helpless. He snatched the sheet music off the stand, crumpled it into a ball in his fist, and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a soft thud and fell to the floor. He put his head in his hands, his breathing ragged. He could feel the sting of tears in his eyes, and he fought them back. He would not cry. He would not give the principal or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing him broken. For the next 2 days, this became his routine. He would go to school, endure the stares and the whispers, and then retreat to the music room to face his tormentor. He would smooth out the crumpled sheet music, place it on the stand, and try again. And every time, he would fail. He tried to play it slowly, note by note. But it was so complex that he couldn't even figure out where his fingers were supposed to go next. He tried to memorize small sections, but they were too intricate, his brain unable to process the flood of information. He was trying to read a language he didn't understand, using an alphabet he didn't know. The weight of the principal's expectation was a physical presence in the room, a heavy blanket that suffocated him. Every time he played a wrong note, he could hear the principal's voice in his head, cold and mocking. Nonsense. It's all just music. Every time his fingers fumbled, he could feel the eyes of the entire school on him, watching him fail. The fear of public humiliation was a constant gnawing ache in his stomach. He was trapped in a nightmare, and he couldn't wake up. On the 3rd day, he was so frustrated that he almost gave up. He sat at the piano for an hour, his hands resting limply on the keys, unable to bring himself to even try. He just stared at the wall, his mind blank. He thought about going to the principal, about telling him he couldn't do it, about accepting whatever punishment was coming. At least it would be over. At least the daily torture would end. But then, he saw the principal's face in his mind, the smug look of triumph he would have. He would have won. He would have successfully broken him, and that was a thought he couldn't bear. That evening, he went home feeling defeated in a way he never had before. He didn't go to his room. He didn't turn on the TV. He walked straight to the small, cozy kitchen where his grandmother was sitting at the table, peeling potatoes for dinner. She was a small woman with kind eyes and wrinkled hands that moved with a slow, steady grace. She had seen a lot in her life, more than he could ever imagine. And she had a wisdom that went deeper than books. She looked up at him as he walked in, and her smile faded. She knew him too well. She could see the heaviness in his shoulders, the sadness in his eyes. "What's wrong, baby?" she asked, her voice soft and gentle. He sat down at the table across from her, the story tumbling out of him in a rush of words and emotion. He told her everything about the assembly, about the principal's public challenge, about the impossible piece of music, about his humiliating failure in the music room. He didn't hold anything back. He told her how he felt trapped, how he felt like a pawn in a game he didn't understand, how he was scared and angry and ashamed. As he spoke, her expression changed. Her eyes, which were usually so warm and full of light, hardened. She stopped peeling the potato, her knife resting on the table. She listened to his whole story without interrupting, her hands clasped in her lap. When he was finished, the kitchen was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke, and her voice was different. It wasn't just gentle. It was strong, like steel wrapped in velvet. "That man," she said, her voice low and steady, "he didn't do that because he thinks you're a good musician. He did it because he thinks you're an easy target." He looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "He saw a quiet boy, a boy who tries not to be seen," she said, her eyes locked on his. "He thought he could put you on that stage and make a fool out of you. He thought he could show everyone that you don't belong. He wanted to break you down in front of everybody." Her words cut right through him because he knew she was right. He had felt it, but he hadn't been able to put it into words. She was giving a name to the injustice he was feeling. "So what am I supposed to do?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't play it. I'm going to fail." She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Now you listen to me and you listen good. You are not going to quit. You are not going to let that man win. You hear me?" He nodded, captivated by her strength. "He gave you a stage, baby. A big, beautiful stage with a grand piano on it. He thought he was giving you a cage, but it's a stage. And you are not going to let him turn it into a cage. You are not going to crawl off that stage with your tail between your legs. You are going to walk out there with your head held high." He asked, a desperate edge to his voice. "How can I do that if I can't even play the music?" She picked up her knife and started peeling the potato again, her movements slow and deliberate. "He told you to play that piece of paper," she said, not looking at him. "He told you to play his music, his way. He set you up to fail at his game." She finally looked up at him, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "So don't play his game?" He stared at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "Don't try to be a pianist," she said simply. "You're not a pianist. You're a drummer. You're a musician. You have rhythm in your soul. So stop trying to read that paper and start listening to the music. Stop trying to play the notes and start playing the feeling." Her words were like a key unlocking a door in his mind. Don't play his game. Stop trying to be a pianist. Be a musician. It was so simple, yet it was a revolutionary idea. He had been so focused on what he couldn't do, on the notes he couldn't play, that he had completely forgotten about what he could do. He had forgotten about his own strengths, his own voice. "You see," she continued, her voice softening again, "that man, he only sees one kind of excellence. He sees the kind you can learn from a book, the kind you can measure on a test. He doesn't see the kind that comes from the heart. He doesn't see the rhythm. He doesn't see the soul. But you have it. And it's time you let everyone else see it too." That night, for the first time all week, he didn't feel defeated. He felt a spark of something else. It wasn't confidence, not yet. It was something more like defiance, a quiet, burning fire in his chest. His grandmother was right. He was not going to be a victim. He was not going to be a joke. He would face the impossible task, but he would do it on his own terms. He would not play the principal's piece. He would play his own. The next morning, he didn't go to the music room. He went to the school library instead, a place he rarely visited. It was quiet and smelled of old paper and floor wax. He walked past the study carrels and the fiction section, heading straight for the back, to the small collection of media the school had accumulated over the years. He wasn't looking for a book. He was looking for a listening station. An old pair of headphones connected to a computer that could access the school's digital music library. He found one in a dusty corner, put on the bulky headphones, and typed the name of the composer and the piece into the search bar. For the next hour, he just listened. He didn't look at the sheet music. He didn't even think about the piano keys. He closed his eyes and let the recording of the Liszt piece wash over him. He listened to it not as a mountain he had to climb, but as a story he had to understand. He could hear the fury in the fast, cascading notes, a storm of sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. He could hear the sadness in the slow, haunting melodies, a deep, aching cry that seemed to come from the very soul of the piano. He could hear the moments of triumph, where the music soared and swelled, full of power and light. It was a complex, emotional journey. And he realized he had been so focused on the technical difficulty that he had completely missed the point. The music wasn't just a collection of notes. It was a person screaming, laughing, crying, and fighting, all at the same time. He listened to it over and over again. He listened to 5 different versions by 5 different pianists. Each one played the same notes, but they all told a slightly different story. One was aggressive and angry. Another was delicate and sorrowful. A third was full of a grand, sweeping romance. He began to understand what his grandmother meant. The notes on the page were just suggestions, a blueprint. The real music was in the feeling, in the interpretation. The principal had given him the blueprint, but he had to decide what kind of building he wanted to make with it. That afternoon, he went back to the music room, but he didn't take the sheet music out of his bag. He sat at the piano, closed his eyes, and tried to hum the main melody. He couldn't get all the notes right, but he could feel the shape of it in his throat. Then he did something that felt completely wrong and completely right at the same time. He started to play. But he didn't play the Liszt piece. He played the rhythm. He brought his drummer's hands to the piano. He used his left hand to tap out a steady, throbbing beat on the lower notes, a heartbeat. It was a simple, powerful rhythm, the kind of rhythm that lived in the music he grew up listening to. The kind of rhythm that lived in him. With his right hand, he started to pick out the melody. He didn't play it perfectly. He missed notes. He simplified the complicated runs. But he played it with the rhythm he had established with his left hand. Suddenly, the music didn't feel so foreign anymore. It felt grounded. It had a pulse. It had a soul. It was a small, clumsy start, but it was a start. It was the first time he had played something at the piano that didn't sound like a mistake. It sounded like a beginning. For the next 2 days, this became his new method. He would spend the morning listening to different recordings, absorbing the emotion and the structure of the piece. He would listen to it not as a classical composition, but as a jam session. He would listen for the spaces between the notes, the moments of silence that were just as important as the sound. He would listen for the underlying groove, the hidden pocket of rhythm that was buried beneath the flurry of notes. Then, in the afternoon, he would go to the piano and he would deconstruct it. He would take a small section, maybe just for bars, and he would find the rhythm in it. He would experiment with different ways of playing it, using his left hand to create a bass line, a foundation. He was treating the piano like a drum kit. The low notes were his kick drum, providing the thump. The mid-range notes were his snare, providing the snap. The high notes were his hi-hat, providing the shimmer and the sizzle. He was no longer trying to be a classical pianist. He was a drummer who had found a new kind of drum set. He started to improvise. He would play the main melody as it was written, but then he would wander off, adding his own little runs and trills. Little flourishes that weren't on the page. He would take a fast, aggressive passage and slow it down, stretching it out, making it bluesy and soulful. He would take a slow, sad melody and add a syncopated rhythm to it, giving it a swing, a sense of hope and forward motion. He was fusing the Liszt piece with the music that was truly his. He was weaving in the sounds of jazz, the raw emotion of the blues, the uplifting spirit of the gospel music he heard at his grandmother's church. He was creating a hybrid, a new kind of music that was neither fully classical nor fully jazz, but something in between. It was a risky, audacious plan, but it was the only way he could see to survive. By the day before the showcase, he had a rough outline of his performance. He knew the beginning, the end, and a few key moments in the middle. He knew the parts he would play fairly straight, and the parts where he would let loose and improvise. He wasn't sure if it was good. He wasn't even sure if it was music, but it was his. It was a story that only he could tell. On the night of the showcase, the school was transformed. The hallways were filled with parents dressed in their best clothes, with important-looking community members and serious-faced alumni. The auditorium was ablaze with light, and a buzz of excited anticipation filled the air. It felt more like a Broadway opening than a high school event. Backstage, it was controlled chaos. Students in costumes rushed past, teachers gave last-minute instructions, and the air was thick with the smell of hairspray and nervous sweat. He was standing in the wings. Peeking through a small gap in the heavy curtain, he could see the rows and rows of people, the sea of expectant faces. He could see his parents and his grandmother sitting in the third row, their faces etched with a mixture of pride and anxiety. His stomach was doing flips, and his hands were sweating. He felt a familiar knot of fear tightening in his chest. He was about to do the craziest thing he had ever done in his life. He was about to walk out on that stage and defy the most powerful man in his world. In front of 1,000 people. Then he saw him. The principal was standing in the wings on the other side of the stage. His arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of smug expectation. He wasn't watching the performers on stage. He was watching him. The principal gave him a small, tight nod, a gesture that was both a command and a warning. It was a look that said, "Don't you dare embarrass me." It was a look that was meant to intimidate him, to remind him of his place. But seeing that smug, confident look, something inside the boy shifted. The fear didn't go away, but it was joined by something else. A surge of anger, hot and bright. He thought about the humiliation in the auditorium, the impossible task, the 2 days of feeling like a complete failure. He thought about the principal's cruel smirk, his dismissive laugh. He thought about his grandmother's words, her strength, her belief in him. He was not going to let that man win. He was not going to be a pawn in his game. He took a deep, slow breath, just as he had practiced. He felt the rhythm in his chest, a steady, strong beat. He was a drummer. This was just another performance. The stage was his drum set. The piano was his instrument. He was ready. He wasn't going to play the principal's piece. He was going to play his own. He was going to play his truth. And as he stood there waiting for his name to be called, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He was no longer afraid. He was ready to play. The announcer's voice echoed through the vast, hushed auditorium, crisp and formal. And now, for our final performance of the evening, a very special presentation of the Liszt Etude in C-sharp minor. A polite, anticipatory ripple of applause followed. The kind of applause that comes from a program, from an expectation. The name was met with a few confused murmurs from those in the audience who were familiar with the school's music program. They knew the name of the student who was supposed to play, and this wasn't it. They looked at the program, then back at the stage. Their brows furrowed in curiosity. From the wings, the boy could see it all. He could see the sea of faces, some blank, some curious, some already looking bored, waiting for the next big thing. He saw his parents in the third row. His mother had a hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored his own. His father sat rigidly beside her, his jaw clenched, a statue of anxious support. And then he saw his grandmother. She was the only one who didn't look worried. She was looking right at him, her expression calm, her eyes filled with a quiet, steady light. She gave him a single, slow nod. It was all the encouragement he needed. He took one last deep breath, the air filling his lungs and pushing back against the crushing weight in his chest. He could feel the principal's eyes on him from across the stage, a heavy, suffocating pressure. But he didn't look at him. He looked forward at the single spotlight cutting through the darkness, at the gleaming black piano waiting for him in the center of it all. It was no longer a monument to a world he didn't belong to. It was just a tool. It was his instrument now. He walked out onto the stage. His footsteps didn't feel like his own. They were light, almost floating, as if he were watching himself in a movie. The walk to the piano seemed to take an eternity, and yet it was over in a second. He reached the bench, the spotlight warming the back of his neck. The auditorium was silent, the kind of deep, absolute silence that feels like a physical presence. He could hear his own heartbeat, a frantic, chaotic rhythm against his ribs. He sat down on the bench, the smooth, cool wood a familiar comfort. He placed his hands on the keys, his fingers trembling slightly. For a moment, he just sat there, his head bowed. He wasn't praying. He was grounding himself. He was finding the rhythm in his own body, the steady, percussive beat of his heart. He was a drummer. This was just a different kind of drum kit. He was not here to play the notes on a page. He was here to tell a story. His story, then, he began. He started with the opening of the Liszt piece, just as it was written. The first few notes were thunderous, dramatic, a declaration of intent. The audience settled in, ready for a respectable, if perhaps flawed, attempt at a notoriously difficult piece. The pianists in the crowd leaned forward, their critical ears ready to catch every mistake. The principal in the wings allowed a small, self-satisfied smile to touch his lips. The boy was playing it straight. He was following the rules. It would be a noble failure, a testament to the principal's authority. But then, something shifted. After the first dramatic flourish, Instead of launching into the next complex run of notes as written, he did something unexpected. He held the last note, letting it hang in the air, vibrating with tension. Then, with his left hand, he began to play a simple, throbbing rhythm on the lower keys. It wasn't part of the Liszt piece. It was a blues progression, a slow, mournful, soulful beat that seemed to come from a different world, a different time. It was the kind of rhythm you would hear in a smoky, late-night jazz club, not a pristine high school auditorium. A murmur went through the audience. It was a sound of confusion, of surprise. This wasn't what they had come to hear. The principal's smile vanished, replaced by a look of sharp displeasure. His arms uncrossed, his body tensing. This was not part of the plan, but the boy didn't notice. He was lost in the music. He began to weave the main melody of the Liszt piece into the blues rhythm he had created. He played it slowly, deliberately, letting each note sing with a new kind of emotion. It was no longer just a frantic technical exercise. It was a lament. It was a cry. He was taking the European classical tradition and infusing it with the raw, aching soul of the blues, with the history that lived in his own blood. He was making the piano speak a language it had never spoken in that hall before. He began to move through the piece. But he was not following the map. He was creating his own path. He would play a section of the Liszt etude with breathtaking speed and precision. A dazzling display of technical skill that made the music students in the audience gasp. But just as they were settling into the familiar melody, he would veer off again. He would take a fast, aggressive passage and transform it into a syncopated jazz riff, his right hand dancing across the keys with a playful, rebellious energy. He would take a slow, haunting melody and layer it with a gospel chord progression, filling the music with a sense of hope and redemption. A feeling of a Sunday morning choir lifting its voice in song. He was having a conversation with the composer, with the history of music, with the audience. He was arguing with it, questioning it, and then embracing it. He was showing them that all music, at its core, was just rhythm and feeling. He was breaking down the walls between genres, between classical and jazz, between the sacred and the secular, between the past and the present. He was playing the piano not as a machine for reproducing notes, but as a living, breathing thing. The audience was mesmerized. The confused murmurs had died down, replaced by a rapt, spellbound silence. No one was looking at their programs. No one was checking their phones. Every eye was on the stage, on this quiet boy they had never really noticed before. He was no longer invisible. He was a force of nature. They could see the emotion on his face, his eyes closed, his body swaying with the music. He wasn't just playing the piano. He was channeling something through it, something powerful and deeply human in the wings. The principal stood frozen, his face a canvas of shock and disbelief. He was watching his plan crumble in the most spectacular way imaginable. He had tried to use this boy to make a point about authority and conformity. Instead, the boy was making a much bigger point about freedom and individuality. He had tried to create a moment of humiliation, but he had accidentally created a moment of pure, undeniable genius. He had lost control, and he knew it. The music built to a crescendo, a whirlwind of sound that was both chaotic and beautiful, a perfect storm of classical precision and raw, untamed passion. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. He played the final thundering chord, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the auditorium. He held his hands on the keys, his head still bowed. The final note echoed in the silence, a beautiful, resonant sound that hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. No one moved. No one breathed. It was a moment of perfect, profound silence. A shared understanding that they had all just witnessed something extraordinary then. A single person in the back row began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate clap. Then another person joined in, and another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium erupted. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a roar. It was a standing ovation. People were on their feet, cheering, shouting, bravo. They were clapping with a fierce, joyous energy, a release of all the emotion the music had stirred in them. They were not just applauding a performance. They were celebrating a triumph. He slowly lifted his head and opened his eyes. He saw the sea of people on their feet, the faces flushed with excitement and admiration. He saw his parents, who were both crying and hugging each other. He saw his grandmother, who was standing and clapping, a proud, triumphant smile on her face. And then he looked to the wings. He looked at the principal. The man was still standing there, but he was no longer a figure of authority. He was just a man in a suit, his face pale, his expression one of utter defeat. He had tried to break him, but he had only made him stronger. He had tried to put him in a cage, but he had only given him a stage. The boy stood up and walked to the front of the stage. He gave a small, humble bow. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The music had said it all. He had faced the impossible task, not by playing the game, but by changing it. He had taken the thing that was meant to destroy him and turned it into the thing that set him free. He had walked into the lion's den and had not only survived, he had sung a song that no one would ever forget. The impossible had happened.